All right, so today we're going to get started with this brief session introducing collaborative and critical thinking. So for this asynchronous Zoom webinar, you need to first have access to this particular asynchronous Zoom webinar. Second, you need to make sure that you have a web-connected device that has speakers. This could be a laptop, it could be a desktop, it could be a tablet. Just make sure that you have working speakers. And then finally, you need about 10 to 15 minutes of time and attention that you can devote to what's going to happen here. So let's do a quick quality check. So I'm going to look at the top part of the screen and I see that that red light is inside the cloud. That means that I am recording for you all, so check. For the next part of the quality check is for you. You need to check to make sure that your speakers are on and working. So if you can hear me, then they work. If you are having difficulty, go ahead and go to the bottom of your screen where you see the microphone and click that drop-down menu. You will see a button that allows you to test your speakers and microphone there. And if that's working, that's a check for you. And then finally, 10 to 15 minutes, if you can set aside some time to focus on this, that will be helpful. Luckily, this is recorded, so if something interrupts you, you can pause and come back to it when you get the opportunity. Let's get started.
All right, so we're going to be beginning this session, just the first of several, where we are beginning to think about some different ideas with regard to our teaching and our learning. So the big idea for us is, how are we going to structure our learning environment for more innovative thinking and learning? So for us today, we're just introducing these ideas. We want to define critical thinking and define collaborative thinking. So first, I'm going to ask you to pause and think. I want you to think of a time when you learned something new. Maybe how to do something with your computer or a car or some sport or musical instrument. Think about a time that you learned perhaps a new word, or maybe you learned how to interpret a political cartoon or a piece of art or a poem that you read at one time. How did you learn to do that? Think about what was the context in which you learned it, who was there with you when you learned it, how did you actually learn this new thing? We're going to start with this idea of critical thinking as a component of learning. And we're looking at this through the lens of Randy Garrison's text, Thinking Collaboratively. So here he's describing critical thinking as rigorously analyzing, rigorously conceptualizing, and then assessing our ideas. And we do this through personal reflection and through public discourse. And we don't typically do that in the general classroom. This is very different than what most of us think of with learning in an educational setting. Typically what we think of is a teacher who delivers content to students in a one-way direction from the teacher to the student. And we're not asking them to think critically about what it is that we're saying. When you think back to the thing that you learned, what you learned earlier, whatever you wrote down, was it in a traditional sit and get setting like a classroom? And then what about collaborative thinking? Again, we're going to look at this through the lens of Randy Garrison's work, and he describes collaborative thinking as that personal reflection that happens. And when that personal reflection happens, it's fused with critical discourse or discussion. And in that discussion and discourse, ideas can be challenged and experimented with. So the question that we're going to look at moving forward is, how can teachers encourage critical and collaborative thinking? So we're going to consider these questions in the context of our own classroom teaching experiences. Now here's what we do know. Critical thinking and collaborative thinking, just like any other skill, academic or otherwise, needs to be explicitly taught to ourselves, to our students, to our colleagues. And once we've taught that skill, it has to be practiced repeatedly in lots of different opportunities. Like any skill, critical and collaborative thinking has to be taught and practiced in multiple settings, multiple contexts, so that we can learn to generalize that new information into other settings. Now in just a minute, I'm going to ask you to pause the video and go to a Padlet. I'm going to link it below in the chat box. What I want you to do is write down what you see as a barrier to engaging in critical and collaborative thinking with your students and your colleagues, and then write down some benefits to what you think that could look like if we were able to actively engage in critical and collaborative thinking with our students and our colleagues. I'm going to link that here in the chat, and I'm also going to link it down below. When you get to the Padlet, it's going to look like this. You'll see this green board, and I want you to just click on the screen. When you click on it, a box will pop up, and you can type your ideas for benefits and barriers there. So I'm going to look at those when I get the opportunity so that before we come back together we can discuss. So this is just the very briefest of introductions. We wanted to just get you to start thinking about your experiences learning, what that's looked like, think about your experiences teaching, what that has looked like, and then introduce you to a couple of concepts from Garrison's book. First, critical thinking in the context of teaching and learning. Just to review that definition, this is where we ask our students to rigorously analyze, conceptualize, and assess their own ideas and ours. And we ask them to do that through personal reflection and through public discourse with their colleagues, with us. And then also remember critical thinking. That's the other new term that we've learned. In the context of teaching and learning, we're talking about, again, Garrison's description of using personal reflection that we fuse with critical discourse, where those ideas can be challenged within the context of teaching and learning. So between now and our next session, I want you to take some time to reflect and make a note on a couple of things. First, I'll look at the Padlets that you wrote, and I want you to write down two things that you, or two places that you can in your content or your units that you're teaching, where you have either planned for critical or collaborative thinking, or if you don't have any places planned, what are two places where you could develop opportunities for critical and collaborative thinking for your students? Have those ideas ready to share for next time, and we will explore this topic together.